Hello everybody, welcome back to ComedIan MTG. My name is Ian. On this week's episode, we're going to be talking about the cEDH 5K that happened at SCG Columbus. This 5-round cut to top 16 cEDH tournament is now the second event that has been put on by Star City Games, featuring a cEDH prize tournament. So we'll talk a bit about this tournament and break down the top 16 decks from it and go from there. Our first deck here is a bit of a blast from the past. We have Brea Ethereum Shaper. Now Brea was a commander that was seen a significant amount when it first came out, but traditionally has not seen a ton of play, looked over for things like Blue Farm basically. And here we have one of the lists making a top 16 performance. So you will find a lot of things in this list that sort of mirror what you would expect from a Blue Farm deck. You have things in here like your Esper Sentinels and all of your sort of mid-range pile pieces. You have your Thassa's Oracle win cons to help you win the game. However, Brea lists tend to have a few more infinite combos because Brea actually acts as an infinite mana outlet. So you'll see Auriok Salvagers, which will go infinite with Lion's Eye Diamond, as well as, you notice, World Gorger Dragon here. So for the classic World Gorger combos, being able to reanimate World Gorger with an enchantment effect like the ones here, Animate Dead specifically, although this list really light on that particular package, really just playing Animate Dead and World Gorger and playing Entomb to set that up, but that's really it for that combo specifically. The rest of the deck is sort of playing this mid-range game plan with an ad nauseum. As I said, it's a bit like the Blue Farm list we've come to know and love, but definitely with some stranger choices, with some choices that are a little atypical that we know in the current meta. And you know, this list definitely grinds a lot worse than Tymna and Chrom does, but also gets to play the same colors, which have access to a lot of powerful stuff, right? You still have access to your Underworld Breach combos. But this deck definitely running a few more tempo pieces. We have things here like Aura of Silence to be able to slow our opponents down. Not traditionally seen in these higher color decks. Aura of Silence is usually relegated to lower color stacks decks in general. This deck is also pretty light on artifacts in general. It's quite surprising for a Brea deck that pays off for having artifacts, but only 9 artifacts in this entire list. You know, omitting some pretty classic staples like Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, stuff like that in these colors, not even playing Wishclaw Talisman, but still choosing to play cards like Sensei's Divining Top. This deck really does remind me of a 2016 Brea deck. You know, there's very few cards in here that, I mean, obviously with the addition of, you know, Bowmasters and Underworld Breach and a couple of these other value cards, just the way it's built reminds me of that older style. Definitely a bit more mid-rangey, you know, playing cards like Rakdos Charm and Mana Drain and higher value spells, things like Frantic Search, which used to see a ton of play and almost never sees play anymore in the format. So definitely an interesting variant of Brea, and kind of cool to see it make the top 16, especially with a lot of these more atypical card choices. We have Bailey Abner here with Inala in the top 16. This list is kind of running some of the newer tech for Inala. So we have our Goblin Engineer lines, our Emery lines, and stuff like that. Going for the Archaeomancer only piles, none of the 7-drop wizard that gets 2 spells back. And, you know, apart from that, doing the pretty classic Inala stuff. Inala is one of those decks that, you know, it gets played every once in a while, and pilots who are comfortable with the deck will play it pretty consistently, but then it'll sort of go radio silent for a decent amount of time until someone pulls up a result with it. It's definitely been suffering a little bit, I feel like, in the current meta, where I don't know if it just gets away with a lot less than it used to, but the deck is still very, very strong, and it's still a deck I rate quite highly. I think people have definitely caught on to the gimmick of the deck a little bit more than they have in the past, but it's definitely a deck that can still win very quickly and very out of nowhere. And as we mentioned, this line running, you know, the grinding station stuff, defense grid things, a lot of those Goblin Engineer synergies, and going a lot faster than Inalas of the past. We have cards like Daze and things like that, and Born Upon the Wind to flash in your Spell Seekers. So, you know, you're still gaining new tech, still taking new advantages, down to 25 lands. So the deck is definitely different than when it started, but still doing the same old Inala stuff, trying to win with Spellseeker, and then either using Thoracle Lions and Dockside Lions, stuff like that, to be able to win the game. Although this version doesn't seem to have the Dockside combos. We have Mike Sad here from Playing with Power and this Kinnan list. Mike's kind of other deck, apart from Winota, has been playing Kinnan here, and Mike is definitely one of those people who loves to throw in a spicy card or two in his list. His you know, standard higher package is very similar to, you know, other pilots of the format right now, myself, Wounded Satellite, and things like that. But definitely playing spicy cards on here, especially great mention is the chromatic orrery, which you know, I was kind of razzing Mike about during the tournament, but he was you know, sort of like, it taps for 6 mana. I don't know, man. Which is pretty funny, but definitely a spicy card here. Apart from that, like a lot of the stuff is pretty standard Kinnan stuff. Trying to win with Assault Monolith lines, having the One Ring is a brand new addition to the deck. I've heard a lot of good stuff about Copy Artifact in the list, and definitely a card I want to test out. I know some frequent Kinnan pilots have been speaking quite highly of this inclusion. The new card from our Wilds of Eldraine set here is Agatha's Soul Cauldron. It is one of the ways you can convert infinite Basalt Monolith mana into infinite activations of Kinnan, so that part's pretty solid. And then it gains a bunch of new utility, and it's definitely a card that I feel like the format has a lot of room still to explore with. Also in the top 16, we have a Prosper by Shran Horecho. This is a interesting Prosper list. You know, it's not doing anything insanely crazy, but often we don't see Prospers do too well in the tournament scene. It was the 4th highest placing deck in the tournament, so that part's pretty interesting to see a Prosper list, which is traditionally, you know, looked as more of a fringe deck, do pretty well. Prosper is one of those cards that if you let them get any sort of leeway, though, they can really get out of hand, and I feel like it's been really interesting seeing how people play it lately, because there's been sort of this discussion of like, do you play Ob Nixilis in your Prosper decks, or do you play Prosper in your Ob Nixilis decks? And this version, not playing any Ob Nixilis, so definitely not looking to go for that game plan. I feel like you find more Prospers in the 99 Ob Nixilis decks as opposed to the other way around, but definitely still pretty interesting to see. This deck it's got its Hordeling Broodlord lines trying to win the game by casting Appear in the Abyss and stuff like that. But Prosper tends to be, you know, sometimes not running ad nauseum, but this one opting to play this Reanimator sub-theme and still opting to be an ad nause deck. Definitely much lower to the ground than other decks in these colors, but I mean, playing more lands than I would actually usually expect from a list in Rakdos. But pretty classic mid-range ad nauseum style strategy, trying to win with Breach, trying to win by drawing half your deck, basically, and then finding different ways to use Breach as an outlet to actually win the game, or once again go through these Hoarding Broodlord lines to do the same thing, usually using some sort of combination of like Mayhem Devil and Dockside as an outlet to be able to ping your opponent to death. Yeah, pretty cool list, and as I mentioned, not a list that we're used to seeing do so well, so congrats to our pilot here for piloting Prosper quite well. We have Brandon Hill here with Marneus Calgar. Now this is really exciting, and I was actually talking with our pilot during the Swiss of this tournament, talking about how he was really excited to be able to try and get this deck on one of these videos. So it's a pretty cool experience, and I'm really happy to see Marneus Calgar. You know, I was telling the pilot while we were talking during the tournament that the tournament ended up taking Tivit and winning. I was like a coin flip away from actually bringing Marneus instead, and I just couldn't find basically a few of the cards that I needed to be able to sleeve it up and play it right away. So kind of fun to see this deck actually see play. It's got a lot of engines in the deck, right? Like a lot of the list is really trying to take advantage of having Marneus in the command zone. So especially in the enchantment slot here, you'll see things like Monologue Tax, Smothering Tithe, things like that, where they produce tokens turn after turn. And then we have a lot of value cards in this deck. We have our One Rings, our Wish Claws, a lot of the classic Esper good stuff style things for sure. I see Wash Away, which is not a very commonly used counterspell, but definitely really good, especially at stopping your opponents either casting things out of an Underworld Breach or like casting their commanders out of the command zone specifically. I believe there were definitely comments about this being used to snipe down Tivits. But yeah, and then also if you look at Marneus Calgar, it does have an infinite mana outlet on the commander itself, so Hullbreaker Horror Line is definitely a good way to be able to get things going with that. We have Monastery Mentor here to make tokens after every time you cast a non-creature spell, which then triggers your commander to draw cards. We have Lotho, an instant staple anyways, but also obviously very good in this deck. Fairy Artisans, really cool card to see. You know, you can end up in crazy scenarios where like your opponent's go to cast a Dockside and you're like, okay, well I'm gonna have mine first, and that's actually gonna give me enough mana to add Nause or something crazy like that. So pretty cool to see that part too. This deck is also playing the Displacer Kit into Fairy Lines, obviously a great way to win the game, and especially helps when you have an outlet in the command zone. You can do some silly stuff with that, although Displacer Kitten, not as synergistic as it is in a deck like Tivit. It doesn't really work with your commander per se, but definitely does a lot of cool stuff. And this deck actually, I'm kind of surprised at how few ways it actually has to make tokens. I kind of expected a few more token makers where we're really just looking at like Smothering Tithe, Tax, Lotho, and Mentor and I guess Artisans as well, but as the main way to make tokens, when I know there's definitely a few more effects that do that in the format right now. So I was a little bit surprised by how light this deck is on those, but congrats, Marnies is not a deck that's been doing well, apart from I think one other tournament that I've seen it do pretty well. So pretty interesting deck, and definitely unique to see a list like this do well. Oh, I guess I should also mention Grim Hireling and Orchestra Masters also make tokens. Grim Hireling more so than Bowmasters for sure. We have our pilot Julian Reyes here with a Tymna Malcolm list. We've been seeing Tymna Malcolm a little bit more lately. It's been a lot of the conversation about Tymna decks nowadays ends up being about Tymna and Crom, but Tymna Malcolm's been doing really well lately. Our undefeated player at Festival of Nights was playing Tymna Malcolm. Ben's Loeb won Silicon Dynasty earlier this year on the same deck, so it's definitely it's not a list that gets talked about quite as much as Tymna Crom does, and definitely it's a little bit of a harder time winning the actual game than Tymna Crom does, but it is still a list that does its thing and does it efficiently. You're trying to win with Doomsday, Mnemonic Betrayal, your Thassa's Oracle lines and stuff like that. Definitely a little lighter on win cons than Tymna Crom, but also that means you sacrifice that the bit of powerful engines for a very lean and efficient engine in Malcolm, right? It's like one of the best Jeweled Lotus commanders, and you basically trade that for the, swap that with the late game efficiency of Crom and body and stuff like that, and the ability to have red. So Tymna Malcolm doing very well. Good to see play in this list. We have probably our most spicy deck of this entire tournament. We have Earnest Gloomstalker combined with the background of Street Urchin. Earnest is a 3/3 death touch, and whenever it attacks, you return a land from your graveyard to the battlefield. And Street Urchin is basically an infinite mana outlet, but it is commander creatures you own have pay 1, sack another creature or artifact. This creature deals 1 damage to any target. So on a floor-based level, this Gloomstalker list is using Street Urchin as an infinite mana outlet, and if I'm not mistaken, also a Protean Hulk sacrifice outlet, which is pretty sweet. On top of that, if you look at Earnest, it does in fact have Death Touch, like we mentioned earlier, and that Death Touch allows it so that when you sacrifice permanents to Street Urchin, it's actually Earnest doing the damage. So it basically becomes 1, sacrifice an artifact or creature and kill whatever creature you want to be dead on the board, which I can imagine comes up a decent amount, and it's very solid to be able to control the board like that. And then it's also just an infinite dockside outlet. This is also seemingly a conspicuous Snoop deck, which is pretty interesting. Snoop has been a strategy that is not looked at with a lot of favor in general, but the idea is that you play a Goblin Recruiter, you get a Snoop, and then you stack your library so that you can have a Kiki Jiki on top and then sacrifice all of your copies of Snoop, usually to something like, it seems like they only have a Prospector here, but I guess, oh right, so with this version of the deck, you don't need an outlet because you have Earnest, so you don't actually need to even play Modcatcher in this list, although that does open you up to some strange micro scenarios where you don't have a green mana and you can't actually win the game, which is kind of interesting, and it also takes out the ability to be able to combo with Snoop at instant speed, so this really limits you to the sorcery speed version of this combo, but still a pretty decent one. It is a really telegraphed combo in general, but it is one that, kind of works decently enough. And then, as I mentioned, you can win with the Protean Hulk line through this combo as well. So that part's pretty cool. This deck is also playing the Hyrax Tower Scout, so if you draw a Kiki manually, you can just combo off that way. There's a lot of ways to actually win the game. If you notice Teamer Sabretooth down here, combos with Dockside Extortionist. As we mentioned, your commander is an infinite mana, infinite treasure outlet, so boom, kills your opponents through that way. And then I believe your Protean Hulk lines will either fetch you the Teamer Sabretooth Dockside line that we just talked about, or one of the lines with Conspicuous Snoop as well. Playing, cards like Collector Roof is like good tempo pieces in the list, even though they're playing a few artifacts, and the rest of the deck seems to be just generally kind of like some strange pieces here and there, some quirky stuff, but like all in all, a few stacks pieces, a few control pieces, but all ways to be able to get your own game plan online. Definitely heavy on some artifact hate, which is kind of wild seeing cards like Sensei's Defining Top in a deck that's so heavy on artifact hate, and Lightning Grooves as well. There seems to be a decent amount of like nombos in the deck, but enough stuff that makes it work clearly. So definitely really cool to see such a spicy and atypical list here. It's playing a lot of really unique cards, and obviously these commander plus background combinations have really been underexplored in the format so far. So it's very cool to see that, and I feel like there's definitely some more combinations out there that can surprise us someday. But it's very cool to see. It's been probably about a year since Baldur's Gate, and the fact that this is coming out and popping off, making a top 16 is pretty sweet. We got a Tymna Jeska here by Sullivan Brophy. This is pretty classic Tymna Jeska stuff. We're looking looking down here at the land count, these Chimna Jessica players are getting greedier and greedier, down to 23 lands, crazy enough. Playing their Animate Dead, Necromancy lines to be able to talk about the Bin to Underworld Breach like we talked about earlier. This is also an Adnaz deck playing World Gorger and Villas, which is just insane. I mean, these lists are going super, super fast. You're playing Bulls of Citadel, you're playing Villas, you're playing Ad Nauseam, and you're playing World Gorger Dragon, and 23 lands. And somehow this Adnaz curve is probably still upsettingly, still only a 1.31 for sure. Definitely a list looking to accrue a lot of value to get a little greedy and jam many permanents. The idea is use Jessica only as an outlet and occasionally a board control piece, and then a lot of these dorky creatures are either becoming sacrifice fodder that will go get you your Ad Nauseam super early, or they're becoming little Tymna attackers that draw you a bunch of cards, get you a bunch of value. It's probably like the most consistent Mardu list in the format right now, sorry to say, Dihada, and it's been doing very well, definitely with a lot of different pilots trying to make it work. It's a quick list, definitely explodes out of the gates and puts up a lot of work. Speaking of Dihada, we have Corey Halsup. So actually, interesting story about this tournament and this player. Corey and I were paired together in the last round of Swiss, and what happened was there was actually a bit of, and this is one of the biggest areas of contention for this tournament. It had been running pretty smoothly up until this last round, and what had happened was players were being paired not by their records exclusively, but by how many wins they had. So it didn't matter how many draws people had, and therefore players who had been sort of trying to draw into the top 16 and had been, drawing games accordingly earlier in the day, were ending up in scenarios in which they had to play win-and-ins when they didn't need to do that earlier in the day, and it threw off a lot of breakers, threw off a lot of records. The reason I bring that up with Corey is because he and I were both in a situation where we were looking to draw our final match and ended up in a situation where we actually had to play each other. We ended the round in a draw, thank goodness, but we were both able to get into the top 16, and we both basically agreed that if we presented a lethal board state ahead of the time, we agreed that we would draw the game so that both of us could get in. And just because it worked out better for literally every player in the pod that way, as opposed to, trying to get greedy and assuming you were going to win that 25%. It was definitely not the best communicated part of the tournament. It was one of those things that I'd said to the people running the tournament at the time, which was, had we been aware that that was the system ahead of time, we would have happily played our games and not, ended up in a scenario where 5, 6, 7, 8 players were caught off guard expecting to draw into the top 16 and then had to fight for it. I don't mind scenarios that make it harder for people to draw into top 16. I like when the game is actually being forced to be played. The problem I had with the scenario was that no one was aware that was the case, and therefore made poor decisions earlier in the day because of that, right? So it wasn't necessarily the problem that we had to play the last game. The problem was that we had drawn earlier rounds expecting not to play the last game, and therefore making a worse decision for ourselves overall. So that part was a little frustrating, and I kind of wish that had been communicated to the players ahead of time, and it's definitely some feedback I'd like to throw at Star City for that, which was, you end up in a scenario where like 10 plus players were pretty upset. We had the second ranked highest player in the entire tournament playing against, they got paired all the way down to a player who only had a single win. And, there were several players who were on win-and-ins playing against the person who definitely did not need to even play the game to make top 16. And it just ended up with like kind of a lot of feel bads and putting players, and also just ruining a bunch of breakers too, which is pretty rough, right? Especially if you're doing like not a random Swiss, to then have it sort of be random at the last round was not great, particularly. Back to Corey and his pretty sweet Dihada list. This is a turbo Dihada thing, right? So we're trying to go as fast as possible. Another 24 land deck here. This is the inspiration for Mardu Summer. Dihada, one of the best out of time decks in the format. For those who don't know, Dihada, the main combo with the deck is that you get Underworld Breach and then this card here, Flicker, in the sorceries, which says remove target non-token permanent from the game, then return to play under its owner's control. And it will be able to flicker Dihada, and you basically end up in a scenario where you're netting 2 treasures and netting 1 card every time you go through that loop. So it becomes a really, really efficient way to be able to breach with this card. So you basically have this breach outlet in the command zone. It's like as if Brain Freeze was one of the cards in your command zone. And so because of that, Flicker Dihada is a very efficient way to win, whereas Rogsai is the fastest turbo turbo ad nauseum deck in the format, Dihada is definitely the fastest turbo Underworld Breach deck in the format. And Dihada's ability to basically come down and immediately refund herself makes it extremely explosive. I've definitely seen this deck win super, super early, but also like be able to grind repeatedly. One thing I've learned from a lot of Dihada players, never kill Dihada. Make it so that they cannot use the -3 over and over again for sure if you want to chip it down a little bit, but killing Dihada only fuels their breach lines, only adds more to the graveyard, so not the move for sure. Apart from that, it's a lot of Mardu, either go fast stuff or some grindier pieces like Mayhem Devil and Luris and Bowmasters and stuff like that. But yeah, super quick deck, super explosive, and love to see it. We have Carlos Salvador with the Yuriko list from SCG Columbus. Yuriko's been more consistent lately. We're pinning up repeated results tournament after tournament, which is pretty sweet. I've been doing a couple coaching sessions with some Yuriko pilots, and it's been really, really interesting conversations talking about, what are most Yuriko pilots pivoting towards nowadays. And a lot of the conversation was this Yuriko list is like doing better because, first of all, the existence of Bowmasters, right? Bowmasters being able to hate on a lot of the draw in the format, and Yuriko being able to accrue value outside of Bowmasters, right? So Bowmasters can be on the battlefield and not really affect anything of what Yuriko is doing, apart from a few pieces like Infiltrator and Ninja Deep Hours. And then, if we're living in a Rhystic Study format, which it seems to be pretty heavily skewed towards at the moment, Yuriko is really good at being able to grind out the game and end up in scenarios where it doesn't matter how many cards your opponents are drawing. Yuriko is kind of getting through that with things like Ninjutsu and stuff like that, and just being able to refill its hand without casting a ton of spells. Really cool to see Yuriko doing well. It's been a deck that I've loved for a really long time, and I feel like it's now at the point where it's like, okay, this deck is actually starting to like consistently put up results and consistently push for wins, which is nice. This is my list from the top 16 of this tournament. This is a list I call Sisei Take the Wheel. It's my 5-color Sisei list with a few adaptations from when I top forward Chaos Treasure Series 3 with it. Definitely added some new cards here and there. I've been playing the list a decent amount, and it's quite similar to the one that we did the deck tech here on this channel of, which I can leave a little card here for if you want to check that out and get a little bit more of an in-depth examination of this deck. Today, I'm mostly going to focus on the things that are different about this list from the last time that I talked about it. The main ones being a few pieces here. One, Flowering of the White Tree is no longer in the deck. I found that to be a little slow and not doing what I wanted to. I've added Blind Obedience. Shout out to Malcolm from the Ramp Gang about this one. I think it's a really good tempo piece. Back up to 30 lands in the deck. I just find that Sisei activations need to be so consistent, and I'm very happy to be activating Sisei over and over again. I don't remember if Sky Total was in the deck the last time I talked about it. I don't think it was. Basically, we end up scenarios sometimes where Dihada will be milling our cards over, or we just need to recur one of our engines, and Sky Total is just a really nice regrowth effect on top of an uncounterable removal spell at times. Additionally, we have the addition of Nyambi, which is once again another shout out to Malcolm the Ramp Gang for this one, just because I didn't really get why the deck was playing it for a long time, and basically I was explained that there's a number of times where you want to be pulling Sisei activations for X=2 or less, and Nyambi is able to like reset your dockside and bring it back to your hand, which is pretty nice. And also it's eventually like in the case that I originally picked up on but wasn't a big fan of, which is more so like flashing it in at end step and then activating Sisei the next turn pretty quickly. But yeah, as I mentioned, the utility being able to pick up and reset dockside is pretty nice. And then I also added Catilda, Dawnheart Prime, just another efficient legend. The legends that add 2 colors to Sisei are really, really vital and really important to be able to get your combos going. So the fact that we have, Catilda, Nyambi, Lotho, Lavinia, and Kinnan at the 2-drop slot is really, really solid, and those are like the perfect kind of cards to be adding to this deck. There's definitely a few more in this general vicinity of cards that I'm like looking to add, and just because it makes the deck so much more consistent because of that. But yeah, I love this Sisei deck. It's one of my favorite decks to be piloting right now. It's really fun. I love going through all of the pivot lines, to be able to pull my cards out of my deck, be able to, sequence ways that are really, really exciting, and I love playing it. It's a really fun deck. Lost in the top 16 to what is perhaps the most crazy opening hand and top decks that I've ever seen from Wounded Satellite, who we will be talking about later in this episode. But the deck did perform really, really well. I feel like I've had a bad string of luck when it comes to top 16 matches for kind of like a lot of non-games in a row, which was rather unfortunate, but still very happy with this run, happy to make it in the top 16, and happy to do it with a deck I really enjoy. We have SCG Columbus top 16 by SGambi. This is a pretty classic Turbo Nagila list, a deck that you should be very familiar with hearing about at this time. Although I gotta say, it's been getting a lot of hate from what I'm hearing from a lot of pilots, so being able to push through that and make top 16 here is pretty solid. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily at this tournament. I know there was a lot of talk at festival nights about Nagila being targeted pretty bad, but not as much here. We have our, classic value engines, we have Underworld Breach strategies, we are playing ad nauseum in these Nagila lists, right? They are just different layered ways of trying to win the game over and over again. You have your Grim Hireling combos in this one, Derevi combos in this one, and just trying to either leverage super explosive 5-color ad nause game plan, trying to win Rhetorical Console, or just doing the Nagila stuff, beating down, having 1-card win cons, the whole 9 yards. Before we get into our top 4, remember that Monarch Media has Mythic Lotus Gaming coming up October 7th and 8th in Belleville, Illinois. That's getting closer and closer, and I can't believe after months of advertising for this thing that it's getting here. So excited to finally do it. Excited to play for a Time Twister. It's going to be a pretty sweet event. Here we have one of 2 Atraxa decks in our top 4. It is Atraxa Winter. No, kidding. But we do have a good amount of Atraxa showing up here in these top 4. We have our list by C. Napier 1990 playing our pretty classic Atraxa stuff. We got our Teferi here to be able to combo down with our Displacer Kitten lines. Notion Thief still seeing play, love it. I think Notion Thief is one of the best cards in the format that got hit worst by Bowmasters, but I love that our pilot here is still holding out the Notion Thief love. I think it's such a good card in the format, and people have been complaining about how good Rhystic Study is right now. And I think Bowmasters not punishing it as hard as Notion Thief used to really demonstrates a lot about what's happening with this format. And I love that Notion Thief seeing play in this deck. It's just one of my favorite cards. It's so good, and I think it's so important for the health of cEDH to have a card like this in the format. Apart from that, we got some pretty standard Atraxa stuff. You got a couple dorks here, not like too many to go crazy with. We're down to only 1 Exile Enabler for the food chain combos. A lot of people have asked about why I only run 1 of these effects, and usually it's because food chain isn't the primary focus of the deck. It is a focus of the deck. This version running Dam, running the brand new Beseech the Mirror, which is kind of crazy because I don't think they have the most amount of things to bargain with. Like, there's definitely a decent amount of artifacts, some amount of enchantments, but not a bunch I would be super excited to bargain away. Like, I don't want to be bargaining my studies or my Remoras, anything like that, or even my Mana Rocks, really. This version of Atraxa kind of lighter on artifact acceleration than the ones that I'm used to, and having 12 artifacts, one of them being the One Ring, and having a Mox Opal in this deck is feels rather greedy, to be honest. This is also an ad nause variant of Atraxa. I have noticed that I feel like for a while the Atraxa lists that were doing well were off of ad nauseam, but now we seem to be swinging all the way back to the ad nause variants of this deck, which is pretty interesting to me. I feel like you just ad nause into your food chain combos. It's not like they're playing Yogswell or anything like that. But Beseech the Mirror, obviously a really good way to be able to get either your enabler or your other half of your food chain combos. And then this list running Time Twister and Windfall to be able to wheel into your Smothering Ties and things like that. Sometimes using Demonic Betrayal to be able to win the game. But it's pretty sweet. The Atraxa has been doing really, really well lately. Not the most spicy version of Atraxa for sure, but it's definitely replacing Tymna Thrasios as the Sans Red mid-range pile for sure. We have Tiv the Time Mandalar by Callahan is here. So this is Callahan, my co-host of the Mind Sculptors podcast, and not only was this their first top 16 performance, but their top 4 performance. I'm super proud of them, and they did really, really well in this tournament. They absolutely housed me round 1 of the tournament because they got a turn 1 Rhystic Study on the play, followed by a turn 2 Shieldred, but they were just running super hot all tournament, playing really, really well, and I'm really proud of them. It's been awesome to see Cal finally get their first super solid result here, and once again making it all the way to top 4 with this Tivit list is pretty sweet. And also the only Tivit list in this top 16. Tivit took a pretty hard beating at Festival, and Cal showing up and putting their money where their mouth is. They've been saying Tivit's the best deck in the format for quite some time, and to be able to show up and absolutely clown on this tournament with this deck is pretty sweet. New additions to the deck, the brand new value engine of Talion, the Kindly Lords, the first one I've seen in the 99 of these lists, but I have a feeling that is not going to remain that way. This card is very strong, and also this was the day that the set dropped, basically, or this was the day of pre-release. So I can imagine, because this was a no proxy tournament, that pilots maybe didn't have the amount of copies of this card, or even any of the cards in this tournament, that they would have liked. I know a lot of people like myself were able to pick up our, Soul Cauldrons or Italians or things like that, but I definitely know not all players had that luxury. So definitely interested to see if this card picks up a little bit more, along with Beseech the Mirror, the other new one from this set. Cal plays a very, very controlling version of this archetype, still going for the time sieve combo, still having Thoracle lines, things like that, but definitely they're a very responsible player and they play a very solid mid-range control game. Once again, using these 4 drops should really give an indicator of what kind of game this deck is trying to play. And once again, super proud of my co-host for being able to make the top 4 of this tournament. Absolutely crushed it, friend, and great job. Speaking of the player that eliminated me from the top 16, we have Wounded Satellite here on one hell of a run with Kinnan. This is their first in-person tournament. They've been doing really well in the online space, but just sort of got into a position where they can start doing tournaments IRL, and this is another result here with this Kinnan list that is basically all he plays. Got actually a lot of chance to hang out with Wounded over the weekend and play some pickup games, stuff like that. The man draws God Hands a lot. I did notice. It is so crazy how many like insane openers he would draw in this tournament, or even in like the casual pickup games we were having. We were giving a lot of crap about that. But in general, it was really cool to be able to meet Wounded and to be able to sort of talk about Kinnan, a deck that we both share a decent amount of love for, a good amount. And also I was with Tyler from Play to Win, who also talked about this deck a lot with him too. Yeah, definitely a lot of Kinnan love this weekend. But this Kinnan list is the one Wounded's been doing really well with tournament after tournament. The big, obviously iconic card, Armored Scrap Gorger, the one we can't get him to cut, is the only one, especially here. Nothing really from Wilds of Eldraine. This is just, clean, efficient, explosive Kinnan trying to absolutely pop off out of the gates, flip over the big fatties, drop into the Void Winter as your Tides Bounce, your Nyx Blooms, all of that stuff, and then just gain a ton of advantage. Wounded also on the Perplexing Chimera lines with crop rotation and the Homeward Path lines, and a little bit different than the one I play. As I mentioned, that's the one difference, the big difference I think between our lists is that the Perplexing Chimera lines I tend to not prefer because I think they rely on the Homeward Path stuff, and I don't like having that in the mana base. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue with Wounded's performance here. He's been doing really, really well and putting up really, really consistent results with this deck. So just showing there's been a decent amount of pilots lately who have been really finding their deck, sticking with their deck, and it's been consistently letting them put up results over and over again. There's definitely pilots out there like myself, like Just Ice, people like that, who will jump between lists over and over again, but there's other pilots who definitely should consider themselves specialists, and Wounded Satellite is a Kinnan specialist for sure. We have our other top 4 Atraxa list here. Andy Beach absolutely crushing this tournament, going completely undefeated, heading into the top 16, winning their top 16 match, and winning the top 4 with this Atraxa list. Atraxa putting up 2 top 4 results here, and Andy crushing this tournament with it. Another version of this deck, only running the Mist Hollow Griffin, no Eternal Scourge, running Grand Arbiter, Augustin the Fourth, which it's so hard not to love this pick for me because I literally have every single copy of Grand Arbiter that's been printed, every different variant, I should say. I adore this card, and it's super cool to see it seeing play. This is actually more of a mid-range Atraxa list because we are running no Ad Nauseam in this deck. They're running a lot more artifacts, 2 more than the list that we saw earlier, but still, once again, a little light on artifacts for that max level, but for some reason these pilots keep making it work. This list running a few more enchantments than the other one we took a peek at earlier. Definitely a few more ways to accelerate their mana, but a lot of good just sans red value pile stuff, and then accelerating into this just, beautifully obnoxious top end of Atraxa Grand Unifier. This deck has been putting up pretty consistent results, and it's hard to argue that it's not one of the best in the format right now. It's kind of wild because, once again, I keep having, I guess, bad luck with Atraxa opponents where they just absolutely do nothing in some of these games, but Atraxa is one of those decks that either does nothing or everything, and I feel like there's no in between. Well, thank you for watching this top 16 breakdown of SCG Columbus. It was a cool one. I'm glad to be able to go out to these SCG events and be able to compete in the format that I love through the Star City lens. There's definitely some feedback that I've left for the judges and players this tournament. A little bit of communication error as far as like how the breakers actually worked for the tournaments, things like that. The fact that we're still using paper standings in the year of our Lord 2023, and like stuff like that. There's definitely stuff that can be improved in these tournaments. There's definitely conversations about the fact that they are and proxyless tournaments and things like that. But they are starting to happen more and more, and hopefully Star City is accepting of the feedback of the players, and a lot of players provide that. But definitely curious to hear what people thought. If anyone who went to the tournament, if they had any feedback they want to drop down in the comments of this video, it'd be pretty cool. What do y'all think about the decks that showed up today? I mean, having a Gloomstalker list in Gruul, a background commander, show up in this tournament, having a Brea list show up, definitely a lot of atypical decks in the top 16 of this tournament. Definitely have some players showing up, putting up consistent results over and over again. So there's a lot of cool stuff to talk about in this tournament, and Atraxa taking 2 of the top 4 slots of this tourney. Pretty cool stuff. Want to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you everybody for watching, and we'll catch you next time. Peace.